Good evening. So nice to see everyone. It's a little cooler in here today, which is great. And it's so fun to talk about space. So I'm really excited to hear tonight's conversation. I'm Jenna Moe. I'm the Senior Director of the Society of Fellows here at the Aspen Institute. And we're all very grateful to share the evening with you. So thank you for being here. I want to make sure to acknowledge Crystal Logan, who is the Vice President of the Aspen Community Programs and helps to curate this wonderful speaker series throughout the summer. And of course, it's important to recognize Soledad and Bob Hurst for their generosity and leadership in underwriting the Hurst Speaker Series and bringing us our topic tonight, UFO, the inside story of the U.S. government's search for alien life here and out there. So we're in for a treat, I know. I would also like to thank members of the Society of Fellows for their generosity in supporting all of the work of the Aspen Institute to drive change through leadership and dialogue. It's a pleasure to have you as part of our close community here, and if you're not familiar, we'd love for you to join. Please find any of us and we'll tell you more. So tonight you are here to meet and learn from these two wonderful people. Vivian Schiller is our moderator tonight. She is Executive Director of Aspen Digital and also previously Executive Director or executive positions with many respected media organizations, including Twitter, NPR, New York Times, NBC. Thank you, Vivian. And our featured guest tonight, proud to be your colleague, Garrett Graff, distinguished journalist and historian and director of cyber initiatives at the Aspen Institute. And Garrett will be doing a book signing tonight after the talk, so be sure to stop by and say hello. Thank you both. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gemma. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to see you here. It's a little warm, but not too bad. So, but this is a nice conversation for us to have on a Sunday evening, particularly as it's not really about politics. Woohoo! So I need to say a couple of words about Garrett Graff. He is many things. First of all, he is a stellar journalist, reporter, columnist, editor who has written for just about every publication out there, New York Times, Politico, Wired, or worked for CNN, Vanity Fair. He's now a columnist for the Washington Post on leadership. He is also an author, including of many best-selling books. Only Plane in the Sky about 9/11 was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. He's written about Cold War doomsday plan. He wrote about Watergate, which was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. And most recently, he released a really extraordinary oral history of D-Day, which I really encourage you to read all of these. Or in the case of D-Day, do as I do, which is listen to the audiobook because it's just extraordinary to hear the voices. He's also a podcaster. I also highly recommend, yes, I'm a big consumer of all of Garrett's media, recommend Long Shadow, which is now in its 3rd season, which really looks at the roots of U.S. Domestic terrorism and all its manifestations. And finally, he is the founder and sort of the spirit animal, for lack of a better title, of Aspen Institute's cybersecurity initiatives, which are part of Aspen Digital, which I run, which kind of sort of makes me his boss. I mean, technically I am, except not really. He doesn't need a boss. So anyway, so it is a privilege for me to moderate this conversation with my friend Garrett Graff. So we're here to talk today about his book, UFO, the Inside Story of the U.S. Government's Search for Alien Life Here and Out There. So my first question to you, Garrett, is, you write about 9/11, domestic terrorism, the D-Day, the build-up to D-Day, Watergate. I mean, everything is sort of geopolitics, national security, global security, and then UFOs? So what's that about?
Yeah. Thank you, Vivian, and thank you, Jenna. It's a pleasure to be back out here. As you know, and as the rest of you have now heard, sort of my background is as a national security writer, and so I am like a very weird person to have written a book on. Full stop. I'm a very weird person to have written a book on UFOs because it is not a lifelong fascination for me. I was not born and raised on Star Trek. I am not someone who is a canon collector and consumer of sci-fi novels. I cannot, or at least before the book, could not speak sort of chapter and verse about UFO sightings and alien abductions and that type of thing. What got me interested in this subject was the national security story around UFOs. And that in Washington, over the last couple of years, dating back to 2017, there has been this sea change in the way that serious people in Washington talk seriously about UFOs. And it traces back to, in 2017, there was a series of articles by the New York Times and by Politicos that some of you may remember that outed that the Pentagon had actually been working on effectively a UFO study program for a number of years that it had never actually talked about publicly. And then there was also, around the same time, declassified some videos of strange encounters that Navy pilots, Navy aviators had with objects that they could not explain. Videos known as the Tic Tac video, the gimbal video, are actual videos taken by these F-18s showing these things moving in weird ways at weird speeds in the sky. And that kicked off this different way that Washington began to talk about UFOs. And in December 2020, there was an interview that John Brennan gave to another DC journalist named Tyler Cowen. And John Brennan gave, at that point, is probably someone familiar to an Aspen audience because he's been out here to the Security Forum a number of times. He, in 2020, had just wrapped up the better part of a decade as the director of the CIA and as the White House Homeland Security advisor. And it was a moment, he was asked about sort of this recent wave of UFO reporting, and he gave this incredibly strange answer. That was like some of the most tortured syntax I have ever seen, even a Washington official ever use, where he says, in effect, there's something about UFOs we don't understand. We don't know what it is. It puzzles us. And some might say that the phenomenon might represent something that some might call a new form of life. And that's like a really weird statement for someone in a job like John Brennan's to give. And I've covered John Brennan, I've interviewed John Brennan, I actually traveled with John Brennan at one point when he was CIA director, and he's a real serious guy. And I was like, if you were a CIA director, there are not that many things in the world that puzzle you. If you wake up in the morning and you're like, I want to know what Jenna Moore had for breakfast last Tuesday, there's an $80 billion a year apparatus that the US runs that goes out and tries to answer that question. We have satellites, we have sensor systems, we have signals intelligence networks, we have covert operatives, we have analysts, we have open source intelligence teams, there are spies, there are agents, like covert action teams, like we can figure out almost any question that the CIA director wakes up having. And so for him to leave that job and say, man, this UFO thing, it's super weird, sort of caught me as something that like, okay, this is worth diving into as a subject and trying to look at more seriously in a sort of more comprehensive way. And I think that proved a valuable outlook to approach this story with, because I think sort of part of the challenge of the UFO story is it is one that is traditionally inhabited by only two types of people, sort of the total believers and the total skeptics. And that sort of the truth about UFOs and intelligent life and our evolving understanding of those two phenomena, which are not necessarily the same thing at all, as we'll get into,
Right.
it requires holding a bunch of seemingly contradictory views at once.
Right. So that's where journalism lives, between
Yep.
the total believers and the total skeptics,
Yep.
to try to get at the evidence. So you start to get into the evidence. And as you're doing your research and as you begin to write the book, where does the story of UFOs begin? I mean, we know there's stuff with the ancients and
Yep.
all of that. We've all seen those shows as kids. But where does the real story, where this becomes a serious issue and where the government gets involved?
Yeah, and that was the lens that I tried to keep with the book, is this question of the U.S. government's involvement, how the U.S. government's interest in this subject has waxed and waned and influenced the total arc of this story. And really that begins very specifically in June 1947. And it begins with what was really the first, well-publicized flying saucer sighting in America.
And did they call them flying saucers at the time?
Well, so this is part of
Yeah.
the beginning of this, which is a Idaho businessman is flying his private plane up near the Cascades in the Pacific Northwest in late June 1947, and he sees 9 saucer-shaped objects moving at tremendous speed. And he, super interested in this, lands, tells some friends about it, gets picked up by the media really quickly, and kicks off this incredible summer of the flying saucer. And there are, in that summer of 47, saucer sightings almost every day across America. There are sightings over the course of that summer across 34 states, up into Canada. It is front page news in almost every newspaper in the country, almost every day of that summer. The Roswell crash happens about 2 weeks into this, which we can come
Happens
back
or
and talk.
happens?
Well, something crashed in Roswell
Okay.
in early July 1947. We can talk more about why that was not an alien later. But it kicks off this huge national security crisis in the summer of 47, which has nothing to do with aliens. I mean, part of what is interesting about this story is the roots of UFOs in modern American life is totally a figment and invention of the Cold War. Because what else is happening in the world in the summer of 1947? This is the dawn of the Cold War. The summer of 47, actually, as all of these flying saucers are being reported, is when the U.S. Congress passes what we now know as the National Security Act of 1947, that creates the whole architecture for the Cold War. This is where we create the CIA, create the Joint Chiefs of Staff, create the National Security Council, creates the post of the Secretary of Defense, creates the Defense Department as a united entity, and breaks off the Air Force from the Army into an independent service branch. So the Air Force in this summer of 47 is starting its life as an independent service branch. The first crisis it has is its inability to explain what these flying saucers are that are all over the country. So what does the government fear that they are? They fear not that they are aliens. There's effectively no one in the summer of 47 who thinks that they're aliens. They're afraid that they are Soviet spacecraft being built by kidnapped Nazi rocket scientists. Because what is the United States doing in the summer of 47? We are building our first spacecraft with the help of, we would not say kidnapped Nazi rocket scientists, we would say talented rocket engineers who we presented unique employment opportunities to rather than facing war crimes tribunals. And that, so what we
That's
are
a
worried
world of
about-
difference.
It's a totally different situation. And so we have, Werner von Braun plopped down in the New Mexico desert, beginning work with these sort of captured V2 rockets to try to launch these things. And we're terrified that the Soviets are ahead of us and have built these first flying saucers that are the prelude to the invasion that obviously the Soviets are going to launch in the summer of 47. And so this whole story sort of has these really intense national security roots. And what becomes sort of funny over the course of 47, 48, 49 is the government launches a series of then secret UFO study programs. The first one was called Project Sign, then comes Project Grudge, then comes Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book actually runs until the early 1970s, and their Air Force intelligence efforts to sort of try to understand and catalog and collect flying saucer sightings. But that the government sort of pretty quickly in 47, 48, 49 comes to realize that these are not Soviet spacecraft. And then in sort of a very bureaucratic way, loses all interest in what they actually are. They're like sort of, once we've determined it's not the Soviets, we don't actually really care what the answer to the question is.
But the thing is, throughout the book, one of the things that struck me is you present, these are not a bunch of Looney Tunes out there going, oh, I see flying saucers, I've had 12 drinks in the last hour. These are actually, quite a number of them are very serious, credible people with sterling track records who provide actual, contemporaneous explanations of what happened, right?
Yeah, and that is why I think sort of partly why UFOs remain so fascinating to us is a huge percentage of UFO sightings are incredibly banal. The vast majority of UFO sightings are actually the planet Venus. The most reported thing that people see in the sky is the planet Venus being brighter in a weirder place in the sky than people think it's supposed to be. A huge percentage of these sightings also end up being our own spycraft, our own spy planes. The CIA now believes that the majority of UFO sightings in the 1950s are actually the U-2 spy plane, which was a UFO. All a UFO is, remember, is an unidentified flying object. It's sort of a mental leap that we all make that UFOs equal aliens. But if you were a commercial pilot flying across the United States in the late 1950s, and you looked up and saw a U-2 in the sky, it was a plane that didn't look like any plane that we knew existed, flying at a height that we did not know that planes could fly, at a speed that planes were not known to fly. So this, it was very literally a UFO, and it was reported hundreds of times. But there is a small percentage of UFO sightings, and depending on the exact subset of data that you look at, it's sort of as high as 20% and as low as 2 to 5% of sightings that are credibly reported that have no known understandable explanation for them. And the most interesting sets of these sightings, and I talk about a lot of them in the book, are incidents, and these are also to me the ones that are the most compelling, are people who report sightings that have corroborating evidence. Sometimes physical evidence, sometimes corroborating independent witnesses, made by people who have no reason to make up the thing that they are reporting, and in fact, actually in many cases, a lot of personal and professional pressure to not be the weird guy who says that I saw a flying saucer. And so there's, to me, one of these sightings, 1964, Socorro, New Mexico. There is a small town cop, Socorro, New Mexico police officer named Lonnie Zamora, who is chasing a speeder on the way out into the desert in New Mexico. It's a small town. He knows who the speeder is. It's a teenage kid that he's had a lot of trouble with. He hears an explosion, or what he thinks is an explosion, off in the desert, looks off and sees what he thinks is an overturned car sort of off in the desert, wiped car. So he abandons the chase, turns his Pontiac Cruiser off into the desert, sort of bumping up and down through the desert towards this. And as he gets closer, he sees what he later describes as two figures that are outside of the craft, who then disappear into the craft, and the craft takes off. Something happened to Lonnie Zamora that day in the desert in New Mexico. There's a New Mexico state trooper who arrives on the scene within a couple of minutes, who sees him sort of physically shaken and traumatized by the thing that he has just witnessed. The FBI responds, the military responds, an investigator from this Project Blue Book comes out. They all find him totally credible as a witness. They find circumstantial physical evidence that there was something that did in fact sort of land and sit in the place in the desert where he said the thing had sat. And there's an independent witness who also sees the thing flying off from the scene. And so sort of something happened to him. We don't know what it is. There's an obvious sort of simple answer to this, which is this is 1964. It's the heart of the Apollo space race, and Lonnie Zamora stumbles upon some secret testing of a prototype of the Apollo moon lander out there in the desert near the White Sands Proving Grounds, which is not that far from Socorro, New Mexico. Except 70 years later, we have never actually seen any evidence of any craft come out of sort of US government, Air Force, NASA archives that looks or behaves anything like the thing that he saw that day. So you have sort of and then by the way, Lonnie Zamora goes back to being a small town cop the next day and spends the rest of his life as a small town cop in Socorro, New Mexico, and never has another UFO encounter. So he's not one of these people who sort of is like, and then every Thursday the aliens started coming by for tea. And so you have people like him, you have people like these Navy aviators now who are having these experiences that are documented by the sensors aboard their fighters. And by the way, if you are a Navy fighter pilot, there's a lot of professional pressure to not be the person who lands back on the carrier and says, "You would not believe the UFO I just had a dogfight with." And so, I think there are this sort of subset of sightings, not necessarily hundreds of them across the last 80 years, but dozens or scores of them that remain sort of genuinely unexplained.
So the government investigates, they come up empty. Or do they come up with empty? There's sort of a popular meme that's been out there for decades that this is a big government cover-up. Is it a cover-up? Or if not, what is it?
Yeah, so this part of what I found fascinating about this book was, as you mentioned, my book before this one was about Watergate. And in a way that I was totally unprepared for, a book on UFOs is a strange and appropriate sequel to a book about Watergate. Because the second half of the UFO story in America in the last 80 years is the rise of government conspiracy theories and sort of the collapse of public trust in government institutions post Pentagon Papers, Vietnam, Watergate, Church Committee, Pike Committee. And it is this sense that the government will lie to you, this sense that the government is, covering up the real truth, this sense that...
Thank God we're past all that now.
Exactly. Well, and actually, one of the things that you see in the 1980s is the rise of the Roswell conspiracies, which exist totally as a post-Watergate invention in American sort of popular culture. The Roswell sighting takes place, the Roswell crash happens early July 1947. The sort of very quick version of it is, again, remember, this is 2 weeks into the summer of the flying saucer. This rancher comes into Roswell, New Mexico, and says, something weird crashed on my ranch. Air Force sends out 2 intelligence officers to look at it. They bring the wreckage back to the Roswell Army Air Base, which in 1947 is home to the most elite fighting force in the entire world. Roswell Army Air Force Base is the home of the B-29 Silver Plate bombers that are the only nuclear-equipped fighting force in the entire world. So this is actually the elite of the American military here in Roswell. The commander of the base looks at this wreckage and says, fantastic, we have found one of these flying saucers, and tells his public affairs officer to put out a press release saying, good news, the military has recovered one of these crashed flying saucers. And they put out a press release saying, we have recovered a flying saucer. They put the wreckage on a cargo plane to the 8th Air Force headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas, where later that afternoon, sort of higher level intelligence officers look at it and say, this is a weather balloon. And they, and so the commander in Fort Worth goes out and does a radio interview saying, sorry, the press release saying that this was a flying saucer was mistaken. This is a weather balloon. And the whole news cycle lasts 3 hours. And the Roswell incident is completely forgotten for better part of 40 years until the 1980s. And then Roswell sort of pops back up and actually becomes part of the founding myth of what we would now recognize as the deep state. Sort of this idea that there is like a professional cabal of military intelligence people working inside the government at cross purposes with elected officials and lying to the American public. And these Roswell conspiracies kick up, become part of this sort of growing sense of conspiracy theories in the 1980s. And they inspire a talk radio host who becomes sort of one of these UFO whistleblowers. And that talk radio host in turn finds 2 acolytes, one named Tim McVeigh, who becomes sort of one of the main adherents of this conspiracy land before he blows up the Oklahoma City Federal Building and then inspires a young Austin, Texas talk radio host named Alex Jones. And that in many ways, in a very weird way, it is this sort of invention of the UFO government conspiracies in the 1980s that lays the foundation for Alex Jones and his 9/11 trutherism and sort of his modern brand of conspiracy theories.
It's always amazing to me that people think that the federal government could actually pull off a massive, cross-sectoral global conspiracy without there being evidence of being caught. And what you have found is not some deep conspiracy, but actually just little incompetence?
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. The thing that I sort of always say as someone who has covered national security is that my challenge with government conspiracies is that they presuppose a level of competence, foresight, and planning that is not on display in the rest of the work that the government does. And so you see, you look at something like last summer where we had these sort of blockbuster congressional hearings about UFOs, which were, in fact, I think actually a really important moment in the discussion around this, where David Grush, who's this former intelligence officer, comes out and sort of talks about, he testified that the government has recovered spacecraft and recovered what he calls non-human biologics, that basically alien bodies that he says the government is covering up. And he, in his media interviews, has said that there are 5,000 people in the US government working on and with knowledge of this program. And I could believe that the US government could cover up alien contact for days, weeks, maybe a couple of months. But you get into talking about something like 5,000 people working at government. Like, do you know how much paperwork 5,000 people in government generates? Even before you get into the secret memos about the capabilities of the spacecraft, the budget documents and personnel memos and the promotion material, you're talking a massive amount of paperwork. And you compare that to something like the CIA torture program, which CIA torture program in the early 2000s was arguably, give or take, the biggest secret that the CIA had that it was trying to keep in the early 2000s. In round numbers, there were 500 people probably in the US government who knew about that program. It stayed secret for 3 years. And in those 3 years, it generated 2.2 million pages of documents that took the Senate more than a decade to wind through. And so I just don't think that we're capable of the sort of, or look last year at the Discord leaks. This was my sort of other favorite example, where in the U.S. government today, the greatest tactical secret that the U.S. government has is Ukraine's ability to fight. Our understanding of how well Ukraine can fight is incredibly sensitive from a sources and methods standpoint. It's who in the Ukrainian government is speaking to us, leaking us information we're not supposed to have. It's incredibly important from, geopolitical reasons, obviously. We were unable as a government to keep the briefings on Ukraine's ability to fight that were being given to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs from being read by a Massachusetts Air National Guardsman who was photographing them and posting them to a video game server for a year before U.S. intelligence figured it out. Yeah. And that, I can't square that government with the idea that there's a secret space under Area 51 that we've had since 1947 that tens of thousands of people have worked on.
Okay, so let's dispense with the government conspiracy. And yet, there are a lot of unexplained incidents that, as you said, the government can't explain, no one can explain to this day. You are an incredibly rational, evidence-based guy. Where do you come down on these incidents, and where do you come down on whether these are actually, I hate to even use the word aliens because it sounds so silly, but non-Earth entities in communication with us? I don't even know how to phrase it.
So one of the things that I would actually argue that the biggest revolution that we have had in human knowledge and understanding in the last quarter century is that the math is on the side of the aliens. Right. That as late as the 1990s, we did not understand that there was a single planet outside of our own solar system. We now
Late
understand.
1990s?
1995 was the first time we had ever actually detected what's called an exoplanet, a planet outside of our own solar system. We'd always theorized them, but had never actually detected one. We now understand that effectively every star in the universe has planets, and that a large number of them, not necessarily even a large percentage of them, but just based on the size and scope and scale and depth and breadth of the universe, a large total number of them are habitable by life as we would recognize it. That we now, that's a planet that is not too hot, not too cold, capable of supporting oxygen, capable of supporting water, capable of supporting an atmosphere. On orders of magnitude, the current estimate is 1 sextillion habitable planets across the universe. That's 1 billion trillion habitable planets. So you can believe that life is rare. You can believe that intelligent life is even more rare. But sort of look at those odds and do you really think we are a 1 in sextillion chance across the universe? And in fact, actually what we've come to understand about life on Earth leads us to believe that actually life is even more common elsewhere than we might otherwise imagine. Because life appeared on Earth effectively at the first moment that it was possible, with sort of the cooling of our planet. So then you get into this sort of weird calculation that life probably teems across the universe. Intelligent life is probably some fraction thereof, but probably a lot of intelligent life. But then you get into sort of the weirdness that we are just a fundamentally young civilization on a very young planet in a young solar system in a very old universe. So, in round numbers, depending on how you want to measure it, human civilization is tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years old. The difference is meaningless at sort of astronomical time scales. Our planet is, give or take 4.5 billion years old in a 13 billion year old universe. The other revolution that we're living through right now is what the James Webb Space Telescope is beginning to teach us about just how big the size and scale and scope of the universe is. And it has found galaxies that began to form within 300 million years of the creation of the universe. So things that, again, in round numbers, are 9 billion years older than our own solar system. So you get into these fascinating thought experiments of the possibility that we could have actually just missed the other intelligent life, that we could have had billion-year civilizations. I mean, civilizations that are far more advanced than anything that we could possibly fathom, that could have come and gone, multiple billion-year civilizations that could have come and gone before our solar system ever begins to gather out of dust. And that sort of part of this is also, as we begin to understand, again, the size and scale and scope of the universe, is understanding how vast these distances are and, what it would actually mean if, you were actually trying to travel across the void of space. And so one of the things that we've sort of come to understand is that the chances that aliens have even noticed that we exist are effectively zero. That we just haven't been around long enough, we haven't been noticeable long enough.
We're not that interesting.
And we're probably not that interesting to more advanced civilizations. and that Carl Sagan, who was the sort of most famous astronomer of the 20th century, he was simultaneously the leading proponent of the idea of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence across the rest of the universe, and the leading skeptic that UFOs here represented aliens. But his argument was never actually that aliens didn't visit Earth. His argument was that statistically and probabilistically, aliens treat Earth as we would treat a rest area on the Jersey Turnpike. That it is basically like a place that you stop on the way from somewhere interesting to somewhere else. And that aliens probably come to Earth every 100,000 to 200,000 years. And so it's not, again, that aliens don't visit Earth. It's that the thing that you saw last Tuesday night is statistically unlikely to be the day in the last 200,000 years that aliens happen to stop by.
Yeah. We're going to go to questions in a minute, but let me just ask you another question. Why are we so obsessed with this? I mean, it's riddled. The notion of alien life is riddled throughout popular culture. I mean, it is pervasive.
Yeah.
Why?
It is one of the three biggest questions of human existence.
Oh, what are the other two?
Whether there's a God and what happens to us after death.
Oh,
The question of are we alone, what happens to us after death, and is there a God, are probably the only three questions that have united every generation of humans back to the first thinking humans. And the answers, by the way, which may not be totally unrelated, depending on sort of how we come to understand the universe, the rules of the universe, and spirituality, but that this is really, arguably, I think, just the biggest question that there is, and that either we are not alone, and there is life and intelligent life all across the universe that we've never had contact with and never imagined, or this right here is the most advanced thing that has ever happened in the entire universe in 14 billion years. Either one of those answers would be incredibly profound.
Yeah.
And I hope for a whole bunch of reasons that the answer is not that we are the pinnacle of all existence in all of time.
You can say that again. Okay. We have mics on either side. I can't really see because the lights are in my eyes, so I will ask folks that are with the mics to hand it to somebody with their hands raised since I can't see them. Okay. And if you could please say your name, that would be great.
Hi, Joni Liebeck. I don't know if you're aware of the longitudinal study of Dr. John Mack at Harvard. Mm-hmm. He interviewed kindergartners in South America in South Africa in the 80s, and they were screaming, and they showed where the spaceship had landed. The Earth was round and burned. He interviewed the pilots that were there. 30 years later, he interviewed these screaming kids again, and he had been poo-pooed by Harvard. They all said the same thing 30 years later. They were doctors, lawyers, therapists. The message was, and they couldn't pronounce what the message was, but the message was, beware of technology, and they couldn't pronounce technology. John Mack died in England. He was making the documentary film. His girlfriend finished it, I think, with the help of many from Harvard. It's a seminal, they said the same thing.
Yep.
So that was the message and the warning to us. Have you studied that, and how aware of you are you?
Yeah, so let me sort of untangle two different parts of that, which is John Mack is one of the major characters in the book, actually, because he is this Harvard Harvard professor who probably becomes the preeminent, does a preeminent study on what we would sort of commonly call alien abductions, but what he and sort of others in the field call experiencers, because experiencers does not presuppose or prejudge what the thing was that happened to them. And so he devoted a big chunk of his career to studying experiencers. And it is an incredibly fascinating aspect of this, in part because it's sort of anyone who looks at experiencers seriously and sort of larger data sets of them find uniting characteristics of them. And that there is no shared psychiatric history of experiencers either before or after they report their experience. And that, which is to say, schizophrenics are not, don't sort of report being abducted by aliens at higher rates, or people who report alien abductions then develop PTSD or whatever. But what they do find is that people who report experiences have all of the signs of trauma victims, that they share all of the same characteristics of people who have been through sexual assault or PTSD or car crashes or whatever your sort of trauma experience is, and that sort of something did happen to them. What we don't know is whether any of it has any relation to aliens, or whether it has something to do with consciousness in ways that we do not yet understand, or spirituality that we do not yet understand, that I think it's entirely possible as we come to understand that phenomenon, we may find it is sort of both something and also totally unrelated to aliens. I don't pretend to know what the answer to that is. The second sort of half of the question, which is the sort of warning about technology, gets into what to me is one of the most sort of poignant and important aspects of thinking about life and intelligent life, which is there is this equation known as the Drake equation, which came up with sort of one of the early pioneers of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, Frank Drake. And it is basically the equation for how common intelligent life is across the universe. And it's exactly what you would sort of think it is. How many planets are there times, what percentage of those planets turn out to be habitable times what percentage of habitable planets develop life times what percentage of planets that develop life develop intelligent life. And then you get to the one variable that actually matters, which is L, which is the length of time an intelligent civilization lasts. That's the whole ballgame. If L equals 10,000, 100,000 years, we are effectively alone in the universe. We are probably the only, there may be all sorts of intelligent life across the last 14 billion years, but we would be alone right now as the only intelligent life in the universe. If L is 100 million years or a billion years, the universe probably teems with intelligent life. And I think, to me, one of the things that, and again, part of what I think is so interesting about this subject is it is this national security subject about science and technology that at its core ends up basically being a series of spiritual questions and thought exercises, where if we are representative, there's a lot of reason to think that L is pretty small. That there's a lot of reason looking out right now to think that like humans don't get another 10,000 years on this planet. There are a lot of reasons looking out right now that like 100 years might be really pushing it. And that, to me, this is where, like, this is the reason we need to do better in our daily life as humans on this planet, is thinking about protecting that L, which is, think about all of the human knowledge and advancements we are shutting off if we end ourselves in the next 100,000, 10,000 years. Think of, what happens if AI, Vivian and I spend a lot of our day jobs thinking about AI, and I'm sort of going to talk about it semi-pejoratively here for a minute, but like, there's a lot of reasons to think, like, there are a lot of really smart technologists out there saying, like, we're going to develop technology in the next 5 years that's going to destroy humanity. And saying it and then saying, we're just going to keep developing that technology, which is like the really weird part of our daily job, is like a lot of people who are like, yeah, this thing really could end all of humanity in the next 3 to 5 years.
Let's go get lunch.
But like, I'm going to keep working on it today. And so, I think sort of one of the things that I come back to at the end of this book, at the end of all of my research, is, the sort of optimism that underlies and is the foundation of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, is these scientists who are beginning these quests that will not be solved in their lifetime, may not be solved in the next 1,000 or 10,000 years as we sort of come to understand the universe, and that we probably actually way underestimate how weird our world is and how weird our universe is, and how much, and overestimate how much of it we actually currently understand. Last year, the world's oldest woman died. She was a French nun. She was 118 years old. Every single thing that humans have learned about relativity and quantum physics, we learned in her lifetime. Like, imagine what we will learn about physics in the next 118 years. Like, imagine what we could learn about physics in the next 500 years, or the next 1,000 years, or the next 10,000 years. And that, to me, like, this question of, like, the Drake equation sort of rounding down to L is, like, the most important insight I came away from in this book about, like, why we should go out tomorrow and do a better job for civilization than we're currently doing.
Amen. Questions over here? Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Abby. So it sounds like you've lived your life researching the CIA and whatnot, and then you stumbled across UFOs, and now you have this new body of knowledge. So I have two questions based on your personal beliefs coming out of this information, which is, are we alone in the universe? And how does the answer to that question, yes or no, change how you live?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I don't think we're alone. Like, just this, as I said, like, the math is on the side of the aliens. At the same time, I think one of the things that's funny is that we probably totally misunderstand what first contact would be like. That Hollywood has given us sort of 3 unambiguous scenarios of first contact. You have the Will Smith Independence Day flying saucer over the White House, take me to your leader, I'm here to harvest your organs for food. Yeah. You have the Jodie Foster contact, sort of unambiguous radio message from outer space. And you have the E.T. sort of stranded lone traveler scenario. All of those come back to presupposing, as I said earlier, that aliens would think we would be worthy of stopping here in the first place. And that what we're most likely going to experience instead as first contact is finding a piece of unexplainable space trash. And that we are going to be looking out there someday and see sort of the equivalent of a plastic bag blowing through our cosmic backyard. And we're going to look up and be like, well, that's not from our Walmart. Whose Walmart do you think that bag came from? And it's going to be this incredibly ambiguous answer, which is we're going to sort of know that we are not alone. We're not going to know whether that civilization still exists. We're not going to know whether that they're friend or foe. We're not going to know where in the universe they are, whether they're close by or far away. And I think that there's a really interesting sort of spiritual question wrapped up in your question, which is how does that change our life? If we sort of look up in space someday and see a wrecked spacecraft or a defunct space probe, sort of similar to someone else finding our Voyager or Pioneer spacecraft, which are our own interstellar objects that we have sent out there. And by the way, there's a non-zero chance we've already found that, which in 2017, there was a scientist detected what was the first ever interstellar object, the first ever object that we saw in our solar system that came from outside our solar system. It is an object called a Oumuamua, which is a Hawaiian word for scout. It was found by a Hawaiian observatory. And it is the strangest object we have ever detected in space. It either is an incredibly long cigar, which is an object that we have never detected anywhere in space before, or it's an incredibly flat pancake. And based on sort of the data that we have, all we know is that it basically changes its, what you would sort of call like a radar profile drastically. So it's either a cigar sort of tumbling end over end, or it's a pancake flipping end over end. And we will never know now which one it was. But if it's the pancake, that's exactly the dimensions of something that we are building right now called a light sail, which is an object that we have figured out, basically you could use a laser to power out across space to move at a fraction of the speed of light, a meaningful fraction of the speed of light, that would sort of help us cross interstellar space with scientific equipment at a much faster rate than we've ever been able to do before. So it's possible we've actually already seen someone else's light sail come through our universe, or come through our solar system, and we just weren't fast enough and sophisticated enough to notice it, which, by the way, is part of the challenge of this, which is you would expect any advanced civilization that has figured out how to cross interstellar space to move at a meaningful fraction, to have figured out how to travel at a meaningful fraction of the speed of light. We do not have a single piece of scientific equipment on Earth today that could detect an object moving at a meaningful fraction of the speed of light through our own solar system. So one of the weirder answers that you can come out of today with is
As if it weren't weird enough.
That aliens are coming through our solar system all of the time, daily, weekly, monthly, once a century, and we don't have any piece of technology right now that would detect that.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, I could ask a million follow-up questions to that. But unfortunately, we're out of time. I do, before we close, want to point out Garrett's socks, which feature aliens. Yes, very, very on point.
Yeah.
And I also want to say that in the vestibule, Garrett has his UFO books, which he will be signing, but also he's incredibly prolific writer. Like, I have no idea how he does it. But also his Watergate book and his extraordinary oral history of D-Day are all available after this. This is I know you all had a lot more questions, but we could be here all day talking about it. It's so fascinating. It really blows your mind and makes you think deeply about our experience on Earth. So I just want to thank you so much, Garrett, and thank all of you for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.